Welcome to How Did You Do That, the podcast where guests share the behind the scenes of their successful B2B content marketing campaigns. The path to success is rarely as smooth or straightforward as we think, and we want to hear all about it. This podcast is hosted by Isoline Communications, your local friendly tech B2B content marketing agency. So I'm Claire Trevian, one of the account directors of the company, and I'm just going to let my co-hosts for the day introduce themselves.
I'm Andy Eldridge. I'm Director of Operations at Isoline.
Hi everyone, I'm Anu. I'm MD at Isoline and very glad to be back on the podcast.
So as you can see, it's quite an Isoline heavy podcast this time. It's a very special one because we're going to be discussing some of the findings of our report, Short Story Long Form Content Trends in Tech B2B. And in it, we've benchmarked 50 tech brands across 5 industries: telecommunications, IoT, cloud solutions, retail tech, and broadcast/OTT. That was quite a mouthful for me to say. I thought to keep it in the same format as our usual episodes, we just start off with the origin story. So Anu, you've been very involved in this. So can you just tell us a bit how did this all come about?
Sure. Claire, you were involved in it, weren't you? So we were brainstorming content is most useful for the VP marketing at our client organizations. What do they want to do, but rarely have the time to do? And benchmarking is so important to keep up with what the industry is doing, what your peer sets are doing, what people in adjacent industries are doing, and so on. And benchmarking, like all measurement, takes time and money. And so we thought that would be quite an interesting exercise, given that there is it's so dynamic the way content trends are moving. So we thought we'd go ahead and have a look at what many of the leading tech B2B brands across sectors that we work in very closely are doing. What is the kind of long-form content they have published over the past year, and do an analysis of it. And that's basically where it came from. And I must say, the benchmarking exercise, like I said, it took a lot of time. It's not anything to do. So I'm quite glad we've come up with a report that I hope is quite useful for people as they start planning what kind of content to invest in, what kind of content to move away from, and so on.
Yeah, benchmarking, we sort of think it's going to be nice and straightforward, but I think what we found during that process is that not all companies are very straightforward about where they keep their content. Sometimes you have to really treasure hunt to find it, and then the dates aren't always there either. Why is it that way? Why do they make it so difficult?
Why can't everybody be exactly the same? It's so much easier for us benchmarkers.
It is an interesting point, though, because one of the stats that we like to wheel out as an agency, especially in new business situations and credential stacks, is that 45% of B2B marketers have increased their content output in 2024. And you can quite safely assume that even if almost half have increased their content output, a significant chunk of marketers, and especially content marketers, obviously, are going to be putting out an awful lot of content already. But it's quite difficult for some of our clients to know, or for us indeed, as advisors on the agency side, to know exactly what that's going to look like. And so conducting a benchmarking report gives us a much clearer idea of, across the different verticals that we've looked at, exactly what the content makeup looks like among the leading players in that industry, what sort of content mediums they're leaning into more heavily, where they're seeing the most success. And as a result, we can, suggest or advise our clients in terms of best practice much better than we could otherwise.
Just to add to your point as well, AI-generated content has increased dramatically in the past year. A lot of marketers, a lot of companies are saying this is a cheap and effective way to scale up content output. And AI-generated content, we all have experience of it. It's just a lot of words on a screen. And therefore, in order to stand out, in order to differentiate and really make an impact, engage readers, are marketers moving away from long-form blogs, for example, where it's just reams and reams of text, just screens of text? Are they investing in content that's more authentic and that is more demonstrably from the lips of the experts themselves, right? Content that's more creative, this is the kind of thing that we as an agency recommend, right, to clients, to say, you need to offer value. How do you offer value for every second of time that your readers are investing in your content? So we wanted to check as well, how many of the leading brands out there are doing this. So that too was part of, I guess, our hidden agenda, not so hidden anymore.
It's a really good point. In a sea of AI generated content, how do you stand out against the deluge, against the flood of information and content that's being put out there, right? And that brings us back to, as you said, Anu, the creativity component, the leading with data, all the other tactics and opportunities the brands have at their disposal to stand out and make a mark.
Yeah, and I think they are realizing that long form content is the place where they can do that a lot more. Blogs and social media tend to get the short thrift of like the AI stick. That's a really mixed metaphor, but you get what I mean. Okay, so going back to that report, so were there any findings in there that either of you found particularly surprising or, I don't know, stood out to you in any way?
I think the biggest one was the debate over gating or ungating of content, which has been a age-old debate, right? But it was quite interesting to see how this differed across the different sectors that we were looking at for the report. And Anu will have some of these numbers at the top of her mind, I'm sure. But I think it was the telecom sector that seemed particularly allergic to gating content, which is no bad thing. We can come back to discuss that in a little more detail in a minute. But telecom sector, especially as I mentioned, tended to gate less content, whereas other sectors like the broadcast sector or the cloud comm space were more keen to lean into gating, following more of that traditional path.
Yeah, but then the gating did take into a lot of things like podcasts, for example, which generally aren't gated. So I feel like that skewed a little bit the numbers in a way, because obviously white papers, by and large, do seem to still be quite a lot gated.
Yeah, you're right. It's a good point. I guess when I'm talking about gating, I'm referring more specifically to long form hero assets, white papers, reports, ebooks, etc. And I think we should probably have a bit of a discussion about that and where we see as an agency gating going within the broader marketing industry. We had a client offsite last week, actually, and this was one of the topics that we were discussing quite a lot. And I think there's a tendency to some degree for companies to be almost addicted to the immediate lead. It's quite a nice metric to be able to focus on, to be able to report up the line. But that's not to say that in every instance, actually housing a piece of content, particularly if you've invested an awful lot of time, as you will have done in creating that asset, that's not necessarily the best approach to take in every instance. And what I think is quite interesting, what we've seen elsewhere in the industry and what we've sort of been playing with our clients as well, is doing a mix of both. So with WordPress, there are several plugins now. Some of the names escape me, but we can put some of these in the show notes. There's several plugins that allow you to do a sort of like an Amazon Kindle-esque sort of what's the word I want, like a pre-read,
Heat mapping, scroll depth.
Some of that too, but also like you can do a snapshot, a little blurb. You get like maybe pages 1, 3, and 6 of an ebook, and you can access that without actually having to hand over your details. You like what you see, you then download accordingly. Well, there's other instances. So Verizon, on the sort of B2B cybersecurity side of their business, they have quite a lot of gated content, but they also have a link underneath where you can access that content without actually having to hand over your details. And I think that's quite an interesting approach to do both, because if you work on the basis that most of the time you're going to encounter, potential prospects who aren't quite ready to actually move further down the funnel, aren't quite ready to engage, but they want to access that content, it's a good nurture opportunity. Why not link to an ungated version of that asset too? And then for those that are ready to engage, ready to actually move to the next step, they can fill out their details or get in touch some other way, right? Everyone always has a CTA with a contact us at the end of a gated asset, like a white paper or report. If somebody's ready to engage, chances are they're going to move to that next step one way or another, whether you gated it or not.
I have a lot of sympathy for our client marketing teams, right? Because very often they are answerable to sales. And quite often, the CMO or the VP of marketing has quite aggressive lead targets. And they are no longer marketing qualified leads. You are literally with intent tracking platforms and other kinds of like a much closer nexus between marketing and sales. Marketing is answerable nowadays for revenue numbers, right? You have to literally track the lead to the end. So I'm not surprised that people get assets, because that's the easiest way and the most straightforward way to capture a lead. The problem, of course, with gating assets is that you've captured the lead much before you know whether that lead is engaging with your content or not. You might as well just invest all your time in your landing page. So that's where this whole forward thinking and marketers with budgets, right, to experiment, and the leeway to experiment, can invest in intent tracking and far more sophisticated ways of delivering and tracking leads. However, if marketing is too answerable to subject matter experts and sales teams, well, all of their content is going to be very sales heavy, and yeah, there's going to be lead forms. So it all goes to how empowered marketing is and how much of a voice marketing has that's independent of that sales, that leash of where's the lead, where's the lead, where's the lead. So it's a little bit of a slower burn, I think. And if you are very answerable to sales and you're just looking at the revenue target for the next quarter, the next month, etc., it's going to be difficult to break out. But the good news, I think, what we are seeing across the board is that the amount of gating is going down. And Claire, this may be because, it's no longer PDF downloadable white paper behind a landing page, right?
So glad to see the movement away from that. And you know what Andy was saying about those WordPress plugins, you've also got so many tools people are playing with, like Turtle and so forth, which will almost do like a freemium sort of model of like the white paper, where you get like, a few chapters for free, but if you want to read the rest, you've got to give up your details, sort of thing. And I think that's quite a nice compromise to satisfy sales, as well as marketing, because I think the feeling a lot with this gated material is that it benefits sales, but it doesn't really benefit, the target customer, and it doesn't benefit marketing. So it's sort of like 2 out of 3 are losing out, really, in this scenario. And to be honest, the people who are going to put in their details are probably your competitors and vendors, and not even the real people that you want. So I'm definitely in favor of on gating, but on gating sensibly, I guess. Going for, SEO low hanging fruit, for example, trying to divide it up into chapters so you can at least really see like how far they're carrying on their engagement, and using, animated items and things like that, just to make it more of an experience. So it's like makes people want to go back. It makes it more memorable. It just leaves people with a better taste in their mouth, I think.
Yeah, absolutely right. And apart from the whole gating, so we did see the whole trend in gating, and I'll be very interested in tracking this over the years. But one of the other really cool and interesting things that struck me is that, we have brand personalities, right? I found that brands have content personalities as well. And it's because you found that certain brands were using certain types of content and they were just publishing that, and that became almost their trademark. Like Deutsche Telekom, for example, published so many podcasts. And that became their trademark almost, or at least as a benchmarker. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, so that kind of skewed the results in some ways. Like across some of the sectors, we started to say, okay, let's take out the outliers. Let's analyze without the outliers, because this particular outlier is skewing the results so heavily in this direction. And I really like that, which is taking content as an element of brand personality as well. And I'm sure there are loads more of the pragmatic considerations driving some of this content focus. Let's say no more, but it kind of almost becomes a way for the brand to set itself apart by investing in a particular kind of content. What do you guys think about this?
I do agree. It can go both ways, though. I think the state of the market type report or other assets, so moving away from podcasts for a moment, that has almost become a little bit overdone. I think every vendor in almost every sector wants to try and carve out their particular niche of state of X in that same way. And that almost contributes to this challenge we've been saying at the beginning, right? Or you've got this just flood of information, this like constant barrage of new content that your prospects are being hit with. trying to do something that once upon a time would have enabled you to stand out very well, but is now become almost commoditized, isn't necessarily the right approach. Podcasting, to your point, and Claire was mentioning something along these lines earlier as well, like it is a nicer medium. It gives you a nice opportunity to not only convey expertise and true thought leadership, but also to engage your customers too, and get them into the podcasting process in a way that probably has a little bit less red tape associated with it compared to other ways of being able to reference their name. So I'm not surprised that we're seeing a lot more companies invest more heavily in audio and video formats than they have previously. None of that is to say as well, I think the state of X is going anywhere. We're still going to have a lot of that. It just needs to evolve. It needs to come back to what Claire was saying a moment ago about interactivity. Not everything needs to be gated. Not everything needs to be a static PDF. Let's inject a bit more creativity and life into web pages that are interactive and moving and almost long scroll and tell a story there.
And you're so right. Oh gosh, yeah, podcasts I think are the playground in many ways for a lot of these companies, and we saw in quite a few of these that they had multiple dedicated channels for each of their services, or even I think HR, like on career things. They had so many different ones, and it just lets each of them have their own voice, be able to talk very specifically to their very specific target, rather than having one that tries to do everything and be all for everyone, which, as we know, pleases no one. So I think it's wonderful, really.
And I like the fact that there is content diversity, right? Like, not everybody enjoys reading lots of words or even absorbs them well. So I like that for the reason. But there was another brand in the IoT sector, for example, that produced more webinars than all of the other brands combined. So what do you guys think about this kind of like investing in your trademark content type? Do you think that's a good thing? Or do you think people like brands should produce a diverse, like, you shouldn't really fixate's the wrong word, but you shouldn't really say, this is my trade, I'm going to do podcasts or I'm going to do webinars, and you should produce a lot? Or do you think that, you should go for your trademark content type?
I think that's so specific to every company, right? Like, if you spread yourself too thin and you're trying to try all these different types, you risk just doing them all very poorly and not having any particular results. So there is a good argument in favor of just focusing on a few and doing them really, really well. But on the other hand, you're limiting your growth and your audience size and all of that if you are not experimenting either. So, I mean, generally, I think if you've got the resources and you've got, all that in place, then do a couple really well and then try and branch out into others where you can and experiment and test out and see if it works. That's sort of my thinking in general.
Yeah, I agree with Claire. I think it's obviously, and it goes without saying, right, for any marketer, that it's important to experiment with the channels where you can reach your target audience and to make sure that you have some sort of presence across the board in that regard. But also you want to be driven by the data to see what's performing best and where you're actually seeing the most impact, so that, as you said earlier, you can report that up the line and you can demonstrate the value of marketing. But even as I say that, you want to be influenced by the data and you do want to be data driven, but you can't allow everything that you do in marketing to be data driven. You do also need to lean into some of those anecdotal insights. You need to think more broadly about the impact on brand and community and other components that go into the marketing sort of makeup. If you allow everything to be driven by data and you rely on purely Google Analytics and your Salesforce insights and everything else, then you're going to end up in potentially navigating down only one or two channels and focusing very heavily there and missing opportunities elsewhere.
I believe that people use podcasts and webinars because it's a really good way to get insights directly from the experts, right? Without that other medium of the written word. And, it allows them to say, and it's quite engaging, and you can put a lot into a podcast and webinar without it becoming too dense to absorb. So
I think the beauty, though, of a podcast episode, videocast, a webinar, whatever the case may be, is it does naturally lend itself well to atomization of that content, perhaps more so than other content formats. So you're quite right. You could take a podcast episode and actually distill that down into several different assets. They extend the long tail of the content sort of theme or the thought leadership trends that you're trying to pull out there. So there's an awful lot of value that can also be taken from content like that. Again, that's not to say you should lean exclusively into that format over others, but it's something to consider.
Just completely. I was just gonna make us chat a little bit about webinars in general, because we've talked about podcasts a fair bit. We've talked about webinars a little bit in passing, but they've emerged as like the top content format in this benchmark. So, I mean, what do you think is their appeal so much now? It feels like at one point they became uncool and now they're becoming cool again. I don't know. What a roller coaster.
But I found that webinars, I mean, I think we all found that webinars took off in popularity during COVID because it was a really good way to get your experts in front of your prospects and your customers in the absence of events, presentations, and things. So webinars became very popular at that time. Inevitably, once in-person meetings and events and so on began again, people stopped making time for the virtual presentations in favor of those they could conduct in real life. There is a really good place for webinars, especially when conducted, for example, in partnership with a publication. You can access a much wider audience, much better interactivity, and get your message across. Like, it has a really good place within the purchase journey, especially for complex technologies. When webinars become not so engaging is when they are just sales pitches, and there's no hook, there's no relevance to trends or other things that are interesting people in real life. So it's quite important to keep the webinar interesting for the audience and not just use it as an opportunity to say, let me just put my sales deck up there and just talk a lot about it.
Yeah, where we've seen the most success with webinars on behalf of clients is when we blend the overarching theme they want to discuss with first-party data or proprietary data, so that we're adding throughout that layer of insight that prospects can't get or can't as easily get elsewhere. And that builds into your point, Anu, that it just takes, yes, there's always going to be an element of a sales pitch, but it takes it away from that straight out the gate, and you're still giving value to prospects.
Yeah, completely. We've all been in webinars where the first 20 minutes are just a sales pitch and finding out everything you need to know about the speaker. And it's just deathly boring for the audience and doesn't make you stay. So yeah, value.
I think another way of injecting value into a webinar is by partnering with an analyst, a journalist. A customer always wins. Everybody loves to hear case study deployment stories and so on. So those are the ways where webinars can become extremely engaging. I guess the message we're all trying to say here is put something. It's brilliant to do a webinar, but put some thought into how that content is adding value. Again, it always goes back to what value does your audience get? What do they come out of that webinar knowing that they didn't know before, which is not just your features,
All right. So I think we've covered quite a lot of the aspects in this report, but Anu, could you maybe just share with us a little bit more information about what people should expect from it?
Sure. Well, it's on our website and it's not gated and it's super interactive. We've just put in all of our, we've just had a lot of fun developing it, and we're let's try this. Okay, let's just chuck that in there as well. You can find it on our website in our content hub, and the name of the report is Short Story Long, and the URL is in the show notes. So go ahead and access it, and give us a call if you want to discuss anything, if you want to go deeper into your particular sector. But our goal really was, and the reason we did it in Q4 is now's when everybody's starting to think about next year's content plan. What do we invest in? What's doing well? What should we be thinking about? And I really hope that it's useful for all you marketers out there who are trying to think about what kind of content to invest in the months ahead.
Thank you, Anu. And thank you, Andy, for joining us on this very special episode. Don't hesitate to subscribe to our podcast and leave us lovely comments on Spotify. That'd be great.